Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving into a topic that's been all over the news lately, and it's really sparked a lot of conversation, human trafficking.
Yeah, a topic that honestly can feel overwhelming to even think about,
Hmm.
but I think that's why we're here, to break it down and look at it from different angles.
Exactly. And, we've got a really fascinating mix of sources today for this deep dive. We've got some congressional legislation, we've got a popular film to talk about some in-depth analysis, and even a first-hand account. So we're going to try to unpack all of that and help you kind of cut through the noise and get a clearer picture of this.
Yeah, because it is a complex issue. One thing that really struck me as I was going through all this material is how often human trafficking is portrayed as something that happens somewhere else. Like it's this far-off problem. But the reality is, it's happening everywhere, even closer to home than we might think.
That's right. And, when you hear a sheriff from Canyon County, Idaho State, that trafficking is happening in every motel and hotel in the Treasure Valley, it's just a stark reminder that this isn't some far-off problem.
Right. And to even begin to wrap our heads around this,
Hmm.
I think we need to start with a clear definition of what we're even talking about.
Hmm.
The Alliance to End Human Trafficking video that we have defines human trafficking as the exploitation of people for labor or for sex,
Hmm.
often using force, fraud, or coercion.
Right.
So it's really about someone being controlled and used for another person's profit.
Before really diving into all this for this deep dive, I had this image in my head of trafficking, being about kidnapping and strangers, but it's clearly so much more complicated than that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
In this video, it really highlights how traffickers, they manipulate and exploit vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
It can be someone you know, even a family member,
Wow.
or it could be online predators, or even, employers who take advantage of their workers.
Right. And speaking of raising awareness about this issue, the film Sound of Freedom, starring Jim Caviezel, that's really brought the issue of child sex trafficking to the forefront of the public conversation. Congressman Andy Biggs, who is a vocal supporter of the film, has been pushing for a national database to track these cases. And that seems to be a common thread that runs through a lot of our sources here.
It does, and it's understandable why. When you look at the numbers, the Greg Reese report, which I know is a bit controversial, it highlights the sheer scale of this issue in the U.S., estimating the human trafficking industry to be worth a staggering $10 billion annually.
$10 billion. Wow, to put that into perspective, that's more than the entire annual budget of many countries. It's a massive industry.
Yeah, it is, and what's even more disturbing is the reports claim that some organizations fighting trafficking might be unintentionally making the problem worse.
Oh, wow.
They suggest that a centralized database of children, which was intended for safety, to protect children, might have been exploited, leading to a 500% increase in the industry.
Wow, that's a serious allegation.
It is, and they specifically name organizations like the Polaris Project, the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children, ICMEC, and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC.
Okay, and they go on to connect Tim Ballard, who is the inspiration for the Sound of Freedom film, with billionaire Carlos Slim and the Clintons through funding ties. It's all very intriguing, and they don't explicitly state a conclusion, but it definitely makes you think.
It does. It raises some important questions,
Hmm.
and it really highlights the complexity of this issue. But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, I think we should shift gears a bit and look at a more concrete development. The National Human Trafficking Database Establishment Act. This recently passed legislation aims to create that very database at the FBI that Congressman Biggs was talking about.
Okay, so it seems like there's a lot of support for this then.
Yeah, the act received bipartisan support with sponsors and co-sponsors from both parties in the House and the Senate, which again just shows how seriously Congress is taking this issue. The arguments in favor of the act emphasize the need for better coordination among law enforcement to track cases and identify patterns, ultimately to try to dismantle these criminal networks. It's about connecting the dots and improving the response.
So it seems like a good idea in theory, but I'm guessing there are some concerns too, right? I mean, anytime you're talking about a national database, especially one with this kind of sensitive information, there are going to be questions about privacy and security.
Exactly. And we actually have a pestle and spear analysis in our sources that dives into those very concerns. While the database is obviously created with good intentions, there are legitimate worries about data security and potential misuse. Could this information fall into the wrong hands? And could it lead to increased surveillance, particularly of vulnerable populations who already have reasons to be distrustful of authorities?
Yeah, that's a valid concern. I mean, how do we balance the need for effective law enforcement with the protection of individual rights, especially for those who are already vulnerable? It's a really tricky situation with no easy answers.
It is, and it's precisely why we need to carefully consider all these different angles. The database is focused on law enforcement, which is critical. But it's equally important to remember that prevention and awareness play a huge role in combating trafficking.
I see where you're going with this. You're talking about understanding how trafficking happens, who it impacts, and how to recognize the signs.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's where this Human Trafficking Basics video comes in. It provides a really valuable overview of the different forms of trafficking, the tactics used by traffickers, and the diverse groups who are most vulnerable.
Okay, so let's unpack this video and see what key insights we can glean from it. One thing that really stood out to me in this video was how they emphasize that trafficking isn't always as obvious as we might think. It's not always about, physical force or kidnapping. It can also involve a lot of deception and psychological manipulation.
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. They highlight how coercion can take many forms.
Yeah.
You know, including threats, debt bondage, withholding documents, or even just psychological manipulation. It's about creating a situation where the victim feels completely trapped and powerless.
And the video also really broadened my understanding of who is vulnerable to trafficking. It's
Yeah.
not just a certain age group or demographic. It can impact, children, youth adults, the poor, the homeless, foster youth, LGBTQ plus individuals, and those displaced by conflict or disaster. It really is about exploiting vulnerability wherever it exists.
Yeah, and what I found fascinating here is how the video connects all of this back to our everyday lives.
Yeah.
It encourages us to be more observant in our communities and to learn the signs of trafficking. Because it really could be happening anywhere, right?
Yeah.
At a local business, in your neighborhood, or even online.
Right. It reminds me of that saying, see something, say something. We often think of that in the context of terrorism or crime, but it really applies here too.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of seeing things from different perspectives, one of our sources takes a much darker and more controversial approach to the whole topic of human trafficking. The Rumble documentary, Cages, it claims to expose the epic truth about trafficking. But it goes down a very disturbing path.
Yeah, this documentary is intense. Cages focuses on the alleged connection between trafficking and satanic ritual abuse, which, to be honest, is a very sensitive and controversial topic. We won't go into graphic details here. But I do think it's important for you, the listener, to know that this documentary makes some very serious, and some might say unsubstantiated allegations.
Right, and it's important to note that Cages presents a very specific and contested perspective. It's not necessarily representative of the broader understanding of human trafficking. However, it does reflect a certain set of beliefs and fears that exist within this whole conversation.
And it definitely taps into a darker side of this issue, one that some people might find deeply unsettling or even triggering. Now, we're not here to endorse or debunk the claims made in Cages, but we do feel it's important to acknowledge that these different narratives exist, and they can really influence public perception and even policy decisions.
Yeah, for sure. It's a reminder that human trafficking isn't just a legal or criminal issue. It's also deeply intertwined with cultural beliefs, societal anxieties, and sometimes even conspiracy theories. It's a really complex web, and Cages pulls on a very specific thread.
It certainly does. So we've gone from awareness campaigns like Sound of Freedom to the controversial claims of the Greg Reese report, then to the legislative efforts of the National Human Trafficking Database Establishment Act, and now to this very dark and disturbing perspective presented in Cages. It's a lot to process, and I think it highlights the importance of critical thinking when we're approaching this issue.
I completely agree. It's crucial to evaluate your sources, consider different perspectives, and really form your own informed opinions. There's a lot of information out there, and it's not always easy to separate fact from fiction, especially with a topic as emotionally charged as human trafficking.
Before we move on to our final thoughts, I think it would be helpful to just take a step back for a second and recap some of the key takeaways from our deep dive so far. What stands out to you as the most important points for our listeners to remember?
I think for me, the thing that really hit home is that this isn't something that's just happening in far-off countries or in dark alleys. This is happening right here
Yeah.
in our communities, and it can take so many different forms.
Yeah, that local aspect is something we really wanted to make sure our listeners understand. Remember the sheriff's statement about trafficking happening in every motel and hotel in the Treasure Valley? That should make all of us stop and think.
Yeah.
And really look a little closer at what's going on right around us. Absolutely. And then there's the sheer scale of this, that $10 billion figure from the Greg Reese report. That's just mind-boggling.
It is.
It shows how organized and how profitable this industry is. which honestly just makes it even harder to fight.
Right. And that brings us to, the various efforts that are underway to combat trafficking. We saw how the film Sound of Freedom is trying to raise awareness. And we talked about the National Human Trafficking Database Establishment Act, which aims to improve coordination between law enforcement agencies. But we also saw how even with the best of intentions, there can be unintended consequences and valid concerns about privacy and the potential misuse of data.
It's like walking a tightrope, trying to find that balance between protecting people but also respecting their rights.
It's not easy.
Yeah, it's not.
And it's important to remember that this isn't just a law enforcement issue. It requires a multifaceted approach.
Yeah.
The Human Trafficking Basics video highlighted the importance of education awareness and just being able to recognize the signs of exploitation.
Right. We can all play a role in prevention, whether it's learning more about the issue supporting organizations that are working to combat trafficking, or just being more observant in our communities. There are things that each of us can do.
Absolutely. And that leads us perfectly to the question we want to leave you with today. Given everything we've learned, how can we balance the need for effective law enforcement with the protection of individual rights, particularly for vulnerable populations, in this fight against human trafficking?
That's a big question, and there's no easy answer.
No, there isn't.
Mhm.
But it's something we all need to be thinking about.
Absolutely.
This deep dive has really just scratched the surface of what is a really complex issue. We encourage you to continue exploring, to learn more, and to really consider your own role in creating a world where human trafficking is no longer a reality.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a heavy topic, but we hope you found it informative and thought-provoking. We'll be back soon with another set of sources and another fascinating topic to explore together. Until then, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep the conversation going.